have Team Hong Kong, and I would kindly like to ask the debaters to introduce themselves and tell us about their speaking order, and if they have, and if they want to disclose their preferred gender pronouns.
So my name is Markandeya. I'm proposition 1. Preferred gender pronouns are he, him. Jenna is going to be speaking second and reply. Preferred gender pronouns are she, her. And Madeline's going to be speaking proposition 3. Preferred gender pronouns are she, her.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to ask the same of the team in opposition.
Hello, my name is Caleb Low, and I'm the first speaker of the opposition. Tajay will be doing the second opposition speech and reply, and Harif will be doing the third opposition speech. We will all prefer verbal POIs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Two more things. One, that you're all strongly encouraged to have the videos turned on at all times. If you're facing connection issues, it's fine that you turn them off. And secondly, Team Singapore already said that they want the POIs verbally, but the rest of you, please, proposition, please tell us before you begin your speech, in which way would you like to accept POIs? And also, of course, Singapore, if they change their mind. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite the first proposition speaker to open this debate. Here.
Thank you. Just for Team Singapore, we have some issues with our mic sometimes when giving POIs. So we'll try giving verbal POIs, but if it doesn't work, is it okay if we hold up visual cues?
Yep, no problem.
Go ahead.
Cool, thank you. I'll have my POIs verbal if that's fine. When a leader of a country has private information about his or her life that can significantly sway the actions and the behaviors of millions upon millions of people, and then chooses not to reveal any of this information until someone close to him leaks this to the media, this debate is about whether or not the media, when presented with this information, should be compelled to release it to the public. For Team Opposition to come up here and claim that it is something we shouldn't do is a very a fundamental misconstruing on the nature of information and public interest itself. Team Hong Kong rejects the notion that private information should be kept private when it has the ability to influence and impact millions of people. What is the critical issue in this debate? It's very simple. When a piece of information has the potential to do a great amount of public good when revealed, and harm public good and actively harm people in public when it is kept away from the public, when it is hidden by individuals, is it or is it not legitimate to reveal that information to the public through the media? The critical response we give you on proposition is yes, absolutely. What do we stand for today on side proposition? We stand for the collective good of society. The assurance that we as individuals are not misinformed, we as individuals are not deceived, and we as individuals are not subjected to informational asymmetry. And we believe that all of these needs as we as a collective society actively trumps the private benefit of one single person and life. No, thank you. That being said, 2 points in my speech today. First, on principle, there's some information that the public is entitled to, and in no world can we reject the public from this information. And second, the practical. The public is better off under side proposition and worse off under side opposition. Jenna's going to be talking about how this motion, if passed, aids investigations into unlawful actions. Before that, I want to note something very, very important. Public interest is very different to interesting to the public. Kanye West's 5 o'clock morning misadventures are indeed interesting. They're indeed hilarious to the vast majority of us. However, revealing what Kanye is doing in the early hours is not public interest. What is public interest are the private actions of important individuals who directly influence swaths of people in society. This looks like famous individuals and famous figures whose personal lives are in public interest. For example, politicians. Lastly, revealing is very different from looking. We reveal information when we already have a nugget of that information or that piece of information, whole note, thank you, given to us by other sources. This debate doesn't consider the acquisition of information, but rather how we distribute information when we have access to that information in the first place. Okay, moving on to my substantive. On principle, how there's some information that the public is entitled to. The premise of this argument is very simple. There is important information regarding the lives of important people that the public is entitled to because this information is of public interest. This information is something which can drastically change the way people think. No, thank you. It can drastically change the way people behave, and it can drastically change the way people act. We believe that withdrawing or withholding this information from the public sphere is, to put it simply, fundamental informational asymmetry. You're benefiting one party at the expense of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of other people. Because what you're doing is you're essentially deceiving the public, and you're deceiving society, and you're forcing them to think and behave in a way that if they had access to certain forms of information, no thank you, they would have not behaved in this way, right? Basically, what you're doing is you're giving people a skewed worldview, and you're ultimately defining their actions and their behavior through incomplete information, which their behavior can change when provided with significantly more information, which is what is being hidden by the private lives of important figures. The question, therefore, is, why is this something which is bad, and why does it fundamentally legitimize the revealing of private information in terms of interest? I'll take you after my first piece of substantive. Okay, so first, decision-making, primarily in the political sphere. I want to note that this is extremely important, because political decision-making by individuals is one of the most important forms of decision-making which any individual can undertake. Because what you're doing is you're essentially electing a leader. You're electing someone who you think best represents you, and who you think best represents the rest of society based on what you hear of them on TV, based on what you hear of them in public. What we think that when you actively are not given any information about what they do behind the scenes, that is something, that's information which can lead to your ultimate recharacterization of this important person, and your rethinking about making a political decision about that person. Let me illustrate this. Imagine if we didn't know that Bill Clinton had an affair with Monica Lewinsky. This would have significantly impacted the way we saw him as a politician should he have run again for president. We wouldn't have seen him as a semi-unfaithful or untrustworthy individual. Instead, we would have remained fazed by his policies and his general identity as a politician, even though this fundamental aspect of his personal life and his character as an individual significantly impacts his ability to be a good politician in the first place. It's because we had this information about Bill Clinton through the media that we were able to piece together and decipher the fact that he was not a good politician at core. It's because we had this information about Clinton that we held him to more account, we forced him to be more transparent, and ensured that he was more reliable regarding his actions in the future. Because we knew that if he could be unfaithful in private, he could be unfaithful and trustworthy as a politician, no thank you, in the public sphere. For this reason, we think it's important to reveal private information that is in the interest of the public, because it literally defines the way we behave on a political level. Second, information in the public interest belongs to the public. This is another principal mechanism which I want to talk about. So, a lot of the information that exists in the private lives of important people is in some ways indirectly provided to these people by the public. That is to say that in many cases, we provide information to important people, whether or not we know it, no thank you, that actively defines the decisions they make in their private life. And when they choose to withhold certain information based on what we give them, that's principally wrong, because what they find out should belong to the public. What does this look like? It looks like Richard Burr, the senator of North Carolina, using information about the severity of COVID-19 to invest in vaccination and COVID-19 related stocks, but downplaying the severity of the pandemic to the public in public statements. In these instances, say that, I'll take you in a second, that Richard Burr only accessed that info about COVID-19 because of public behavior, because the public funded healthcare services and called for more research in the first place. For him to then withhold information about the severity of the pandemic, but then use it for his own private gain, is something which needs to be called out. Sure.
If the public cannot determine what the public interest is, who determines the public interest?
I think I already made it clear what exactly the public interest was in my setup. I told you that the public interest was something which relates to the vast majority of individuals within society. The public interest is whether or not a politician's background into his life can significantly influence whether or not we vote for him in the future. That exactly what the public interest is. I'm not too sure what exactly you mean by that POI. Okay, second substantive on the practical, how you benefit a great proportion of individuals, which is something which is undeniably good. The premise of this argument is that it's a very empirically intuitive argument. If you harm the reputation of a single person, but are able to significantly empower a million other people, then that's just something which is fundamentally beneficial. That's exactly what we support under our side of the house. If we're able to reveal personal important details about a specific politician, and we can further educate the public about that politician's behavior, then we're looking at millions to hundreds of millions of people being better informed individuals at the cost of one person who may or may not have been an extremely good guy. For these reasons, it's very clear that we already take this debate, because we told you why on principle, it's important for the public to have access to information that can significantly impact the way they think, behave, and act.
I'd like to thank the first speaker of the proposition for their speech. And now I'd like to invite the first speaker of the opposition.
Testing, can everybody hear me like this? If there is public information that can save the lives of millions, of course it should be reviewed. If there is information about pandemic that could help public health, of course we would support revealing it on side opposition. The problem with almost every single example presented by the previous speaker is that there is no weighing, because there is literally no harm to privacy when we choose to investigate a senator for how he has invested his stocks. The question in this debate is about whether or not in those egregious cases where public interest and personal privacy are at stake, why public has the right to enter the lives of individuals and to get that information from them. When we look at people like Brett Kavanaugh and Al Franken and the rape victims who bravely came up to contest them, why the public has the right to know everything about what they did on that night is simply something their side has to support, and we do not. What is our stance? 1, we will prioritize personal privacy over public interest. 2, this debate is not about policy publications or the spreading of certain government offices. It is not about laws or documents the government releases, because that is by definition part of the public sphere. This debate is about privacy and the personal lives of individuals. 3, this debate is also not about withholding knowledge of criminal convictions of a public figure. This is because if you commit a crime, you violate the social contract already and waive your right to privacy for that specific crime. 4, on our side, we can still support things like investigative journalism, because we can investigate things like institutions and policies without investigating precisely people's personal lives. Finally, and this is the most important thing, side proposition cannot define public interest because they cannot hold any media company accountable. There is no independent body that defines what the public interest is or means. In the absence of any such metric, the public interest is likely and simply going to be defined as whatever information the public itself demands or wants to hear about. And hence, this is what the media will have to pander to on their side of the house. With that, I'm going to move into our 3 arguments. 1, about how the public has no right to know. 2, that even if they have the right to know, privacy is still more important, which does weighing that their side has not done. No, thank you. Finally, my second speaker will explain to you how on their side, they simply lead criminal investigations astray. But before that, some responses. First, they give you a principle, which is that the public deserves information because this is in the public interest. This is clearly a tautological argument. The main problem here is that they have not given us a weighing mechanism. The only one being that it is numerically there is more people who are in the public than there are people who deserve this privacy. This only assumes that the status is the same for these kinds of actions, but this is simply not true. For the public, they will have very little benefit from knowing this information, but for the private citizen and the family who surrounds him or her, oftentimes this information is going to be large. But most importantly, DESA has not proven why the utilitarian metric is the most relevant one, no thank you, in this debate. And given that they have not done so, they have not shown us why numerical investigations are the most important. But crucially, DESA has also not shown us why media revelation needs more effective decision making. For instance, on their side, oftentimes having greater public scrutiny and media attention will only drive criminal investigations awry because there's simply greater pressure on those institutions to decide what exactly the final outcome is going to be. Finally, DESA has given you very little explanation about why personal life will affect public policy. Note that this is the only line of mechanism for proving why it is important we know about politicians' private lives. For instance, knowing Bill Clinton's scandal with Monica Lewinsky had very little to do with his actual day-to-day running of the White House and the actual policies they should execute. Most crucially, what is important in deciding this argument is not about whether people want to know, it's about whether or not people should know and whether or not they are actually affected by the actual decisions that are being made by these politicians. Given that they have not shown us this should, but only shown us that it happens, they have not won this argument. I'm just going to move into my first argument, where I explain why there is no right to know. The thesis of this argument is that information in the public interest does not actually provide substantial benefit for them. For public figures, this often has limited use. On our side, investigations and legal checks will still exist. Given that public governance is about how policy is executed, what a figure's relationship with his wife or his spouse is going to be like will oftentimes have no professional ramifications, and thus the public has no duty to know because this simply has no bearing on how policy is executed. Given that in the status quo, we already protect employers from asking interviewers about their sexuality, the same can also apply for the media and to give people the same rights. Even if there is some benefit from this information in terms of how people vote and make decisions, this is outweighed by the opportunity cost of other information on their side of the house. The media will simply prioritize information that invades privacy. This tends to be the most salacious and the most engaging. This information may interest the public, but at the expense of other information about policy that could be more important. Therefore, prioritizing public interest actually brings very marginal benefit, given that the amount of interest the public has is static. This is particularly so because the media also covers public figures' families. For instance, Boris Johnson's daughter, oftentimes which have very little bearing on policy. Even further, their side is not defended their majority burden because oftentimes the media also covers ordinary people who happen to be in poor circumstances. The person who commits suicide, the person who is the victim of sexual assault, will have their identities extorted on their side because this might be interesting to the public. In this case, the public interest does not aid the people because there is very limited benefit that actually comes out of knowing this information. Therefore, the public has no right to know. In my second argument, I will explain that even if the public has the right to know, this is outweighed by the right to privacy. But before that, I will take that point.
Do you believe that criminal trials should be reported on live media?
Yes, we think that it should be reported because this is of public interest, but we do not think that any private information should be disclosed during those trials. Our second argument will take them at their highest. Even if the right exists, privacy is fundamental. This is because people ought to be able to define who they are, whether there's anything which they fear would lead them to be censored or attacked in public. If you keep something private, there's probably a reason why you did that. A gay public figure staying in the closet to prevent estranging himself from his family, from his friends, from his community. That opens people forcibly to being attacked psychologically. Even if it turns out that their fears were unfounded, the depression in the interim is immense on their side of the house. Given that information is going to bring huge harm to some people who have their privacy violated and some small benefits to many people, the paradigm is one of diffuse benefits and concentrated harms with the same utility. But I'm going to give you two weighing metrics to explain why on our side, it is preferable that you prefer standing on the side of privacy. This is because the person whose privacy is infringed never chose to do so. Oftentimes, the personal life and the problems within it that lead people to have a bad relationship, for instance, are concatenation of other people's choices that most people had no control over. This is particularly so for ordinary people who never wanted to be the subject of media skeptical from any point they chose. Therefore, the negative right of a person should be defended versus the additional information that the public chooses to want. Secondly, there are certain harms to privacy compared to uncertain benefits to public interest. There are many uncertainties with regard to public interest. Will the public actually care about this? How long will they actually retain this information for? And how long will this actually have a bearing on how they make decisions? But for the person who wanted to keep it secret, for whom it was the most important part of their life that they did not want other people to know, we know that the harms will likely be lifelong and the psychological damage will last forever. Media interest can change and wane, but we think privacy never changes. For all these reasons, we are proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the first speaker of the opposition. Now I'd like to give the floor to the second speaker of the proposition.
Hi, I'm happy with verbal POIs as well. It's strange when opposition tells us that you can absolutely investigate an institution without investigating the people within it. The simple fact of the matter is that institutions are made up of the people who run them, and institutions are affected by what happens in those people's lives. Our government would not be the same if it was run by a robot as if compared to the fact that they are run by actual human people. When we give that much power to an institution to dictate the way we live our lives, to punish and reward us for our actions, we absolutely have a right to make sure that they are functioning the way they should. One large section on rebuttal on whether or not the principle of privacy is more important than the public interest, before moving on into substantive on why we think that revealing information in the public interest aids investigations into unlawful actions. So firstly then, on rebuttal, let's clear up our stance, because they told us that we have to defend what anyone wants to define public interest as. That is absolutely not the case. As proposition, we get to define under reasonable limits what public interest is. And we told you, we think public interest means that the public, when it is going to interfere with the public's right, for example, the public's right to vote for their politicians based on what they think is important. So if they believe that a politician who withholds information about COVID, but more importantly, at the same time invests personal money, personal finances, by the way, this has nothing to do with public record, but their own financial status, which is about their personal private life, into COVID vaccines, we think that is crucial. And if people think that's important, they should absolutely have the right to vote on that information and not be misled. We think public interest also means that we prevent them from coming to harm. We prevent things like miscarriages of justice, which I'm going to elaborate on later, and we prevent them from being deceived. We think that is what public interest is. We don't have to defend everything that someone can plausibly think the public might like knowing. In any case, however, if there is a gray area, we are happy to err on the side of caution if they want to bring up a specific example of that. Note then that they tried to weigh this idea, the fact that there is a definite harm to someone by having their privacy violated, and at the same time, there's a lack of a negative benefit on our side of the house, and therefore one is more important than the other. Firstly, we would question whether or not that's true in the first place. We don't think that we received enough substantive on why not preventing harm to millions of people is more important than protecting one person's right to just being a little more comfortable in their lives themselves. We don't think that this is the case. We absolutely value people's rights to protect themselves from bad institutions over someone's right to be a little more secretive about themselves. But then they question this idea of whether or not we're going to invest about when we draw the line between privacy and public interest. And we told you, we think that we are talking specifically about a certain type of people, because the only case, and they question whether or not we made the link between your private life and public interest clear enough. So we'll make it again. We think the only instance in which your private life is probably relevant to the public is in the case when you're a very prominent figure. So when they bring up things like employers aren't allowed to ask you about your sexuality, well, of course not, and we don't care. That's not about the public's interest. That's absolutely fine. But the case is, if you are a famous person, you have most likely have an incentive. Sorry, if you are a famous person, we think your private life is based on your public life. Otherwise, however, if we're talking about regular people or just weird instances that the people might be interested in, doesn't care, it's probably just a handful of your neighbors. So what exactly does this mean when we say that your status and your public power and therefore public interest is linked to your personal life? We point to examples such as politicians. These are people who market themselves based on their character. When they choose to do that, and virtually all of them do, you absolutely do consent to having that personal life of yours be scrutinized by other people. Otherwise, it's just plain deception, and you're trying to manipulate people into giving up their vote, their protection from the government, over to you, and the idea that you're representing what's best to them. And whether or not someone's character is important to you is firstly up to you. We don't think we should dictate what voters can and can't vote off of. But secondly, we think it is right for someone to think, and completely legitimate for someone to think, that someone's private life has an important effect on what type of politician they're going to be. So in some cases, your personal life is very much linked to what's in
What information?
For example, if they believe that you are supposed to be loyal and faithful and then find out that you've been cheating on your wife, the fact is, even though that seems like a personal affair, that does go against exactly the type of person you've been marketing yourself as. That means that when you say, I'm going to support my people working for like an increased minimum wage, you might not actually mean it because clearly your integrity has been compromised. If people want to vote off of that, we believe that they have every right to. We will point to, as another example, basically any prominent figure who markets themselves and gains social and public capital by portraying themselves as a good person who people can trust. We think in those cases you have consented to giving that up by entering the public sphere, which you have chosen to do and have profited immensely off of, by the way. But secondly, the idea that the public is absolutely entitled to that information. I'll take your point.
Do you think it's a good idea, or do you think it's legitimate for people to vote out a politician because they think he's gay and they don't like gays?
We think you can. Of course, we would regret it if people did do that, but we think you can. If you don't want to vote for someone because they are gay and that conflicts with your moral values, we're not going to dictate that you have to vote for someone who is gay. We're not going to dictate how people want to make decisions based off their personal interests. We let people vote on pretty much anything. If you want to vote because you think their name sounds funny because they're the second person on the list, that's absolutely fine, because we don't think other people should be able to tell you the type of person you want to best represent your interests. Lastly, then, on this idea of when does opposition believe in violating privacy for the point? I asked them an important question about whether or not they would allow reporting on criminal trials. Notably, this is very different from a conviction when you've been proven to have committed a crime and therefore potentially given up your right to privacy. This is, again, speculation. There is reason for this speculation, which is why we allow it to be in the public sphere. When they tell us that we're just going to admit all private information, we think that this severely hampers the whole point of reporting on criminal trials. The idea is that we don't trust the government to both have the ability to investigate these crimes and then pass judgment on these crimes and pass punishment without us being vaguely aware of what exactly that is. So if we think that the judge is making decisions that are racist or that pertain to that person's particular private background and their particular private sphere, it is important for us to know that so that we know that we're not supporting an institution that has these types of miscarriages of justice. We think in those situations, it is absolutely important for people to know this. And when they on their side of the house say that, for example, we don't care about the specific happenings of what happened in Brett Kavanaugh's alleged sexual abuse, we think that is important. If people think after hearing that private story that he did commit it, regardless of whether or not Congress chose to convict him or accuse him of doing it, it is important that people decide whether or not they trust him. That is information that people deserve to know. They're on their side to really hamper that. Lastly, then, on why we think revealing information in the public interest helps investigations into unlawful actions. Because we think that the police are inherently flawed, either because no one is perfect or because there are just instances where personal bias comes into play. The lead investigator gets really attached to his theory and then develops tunnel vision. Investigators have biases against certain types of witnesses who come from particular backgrounds like race. That means that on one hand, the media might just happen to have information that the police doesn't because the police aren't infallible. Or secondly, people might be more likely to speak to the media about things that might be more likely to share information with the media because they can choose which media outlet they want to speak to, whereas they might have a bad experience with the police. All of this means that there is information that might be important for a criminal investigation. Information that isn't necessarily they definitely committed a criminal act, but that is definitely suspicious. The fact that, for example, someone is being accused of sexual assault and this person pops up in every single one of their photos at every single one of their college parties. That is something, if that is a politician and it is in the public interest for them to know that, it is important that people are able to point that out. In those situations, by having public pressure on those people to investigate, you are much more likely to actually have people follow through. We think on our side of the house, you can't have an institution accountable to its people when no one knows what they do.
I'd like to thank the second speaker of the proposition, and now we continue with the second speaker of the opposition.
Can everyone hear me? Thank you. I'm going to look at two areas in the speech. First, what is the nature of this information? And second, how important is it in comparison to privacy? So first, what is the nature of this information? Proposition says they defend information that is in the public interest. And in the second speech, they concede the public interest is, I quote, what the public believes is important. This essentially concedes to the definition we gave in first, which means that proposition cannot limit themselves to instances of public information which they deem to be relevant to politicians' lives. That is why, for instance, discussions around the politician's sexuality or the public figure's struggles with mental health or the relationships with their family and friends all fall into the ambit of this debate, given that proposition cannot dictate what the public interest is. With that in mind, what is the exclusive benefit of proposition? We told you their only exclusive benefit is personal and private information and not professional actions. These are clear legal categories that we already recognize in status quo. For example, someone in a public capacity can be legally investigated for what he does in his professional capacity versus in his private capacity. This therefore suggests that this is a clear line that we can draw, and that is the difference between the two sides. So, what is the benefit of personal life? The first question we need to ask is this information relevant to, for instance, how voters make decisions? Proposition gives us one line in second speech about why this is relevant. They say politicians and other public figures market themselves based on character, and therefore individuals have a right to know. No, thank you. What we're confused about is if the public image of the politician is someone who is loyal and faithful, and that is entirely consistent because the public doesn't find out anything else, then what exactly is the harm? If the politician truly acts loyally and faithfully in every instance of his public capacity, but only privately acts non-loyally and non-faithfully, then in every meaningful sense to the voter, he is a loyal and faithful person. Notice that proposition's example is one in which the voters would know about it even in our world, because when he did not act loyally and faithfully when it comes to the minimum wage, then the voters would find out. It is unclear why personal and private information is needed in this instance. But I want to point out that there is a far more important question we have to ask here, which is, should this information be relevant? Because notice this motion puts us in a position to determine what should and should not be relevant to the decisions of voters, independent of what is and is not relevant in the status quo. We would argue that voting is instrumental. The point of voting is to aggregate the preferences of voters rather than just let them tick a box on a sheet of paper. If voting is instrumental, then the form of voting which most closely reflects the interests of voters is the preferable one. The form of voting that closely reflects the interests of voters is voting on opposition, where it is not relevant to the character of the politician or irrelevant characteristics like their sexuality, their gender identity, or their sexual past. We would argue when the media no longer reports on these things, this shifts what voters focus on towards substantive policy positions. This improves the nature of voting on our side when voters are no longer misled by the gaslighting of personal marketing that proposition engages in. So the exclusive benefit of proposition is not a benefit at all. Second, on criminal trials. First, they tell us that criminal trials must be made public in order for the public to scrutinize. What they haven't done is weigh this against the harm to victims. If victims want to disclose the nature of their trial, we are perfectly willing to do so because you recognize that criminals often forfeit certain rights, such as the freedom to movement, and the right to privacy is a similar right which they would forfeit. What proposition hasn't dealt with is if the victim themselves does not want to disclose this information, proposition must forcibly do so. Here's where they misunderstand our example of Brett Kavanaugh. If Brett Kavanaugh's accuser did not want to go public with her identity and the details of her past, proposition would still force her to do so, given that it is in the public interest. Thus far, we have heard no justification as to why overriding this consent is something that is legitimate in the first place. Second, their new argument on police investigations. We have two responses. The mechanism of public pressure that proposition relies on is in fact a highly counterproductive one. It forces police to conduct investigations in a highly hasty manner in order to satisfy the demands of the public, which is baying for blood. It is therefore unlikely to collect as many facts as possible and likely to skip over many relevant details that are material to the facts of the case. Second, it is likely to force the police into a certain decision. When the entire public is on one side of the police investigation, there becomes huge public pressure on the police to find details in that direction. And it also becomes far harder to find impartial jurors in these cases. So in fact, police investigations are harmed at their world. At the end of this issue, I want to again point out that proposition has not fulfilled their burden. Almost every example they give you is about politicians and people in public office. This does not deal with the vast majority of this debate, which are about public figures like celebrities or, for example, leaders of charities, which are not at all affected by what voters choose or choose not to vote on. Until proposition can prove why their case is relevant in these examples, we win this debate. Second question, what is more important, Even if we accept the public has a right to know, privacy is more important for 3 reasons. First,
Point-
that there are concentrated harms, hold on a moment, and diffuse benefits. The harm of privacy is immense to the individual, but the right to know is a small benefit to everyone. That is why the numeric analysis you get from proposition is why there are millions of people in the public does not make any sense. Before I move on, I'll take the point.
If a presidential candidate developed dementia but chose to keep this private, should we report it?
No, we shouldn't, because if the dementia does not show in his public life, i.e. he's able to continue functioning as normal, then there is no relevance to voters. I would suggest if someone develops a severe case of dementia, that is probably quite obvious to people and they would vote him out anyway. So the second reason why privacy is more important is because individuals did not consent. Often, media does not only reveal information about politicians themselves, but highly relevant people like their family or friends. Or even when it comes to the politician, the details of their personal lives are not within their control. For example, a politician cannot dictate whether his child develops a mental illness or whether he has strained relationships with his wife. These things are outside the realm of consent. So even if it is true that people consent to put all of their information in the public, as second proposition says, this does not apply to a vast majority of people in this debate. Third, the harms to privacy are certain and the benefits are uncertain. At the end of this debate, it is uncertain as to whether the public is benefited or is not benefited through the disclosure of this information. What is certain is that people's privacy is harmed given that they chose not to reveal this information in the very first place. Those are 3 reasons why privacy is more important, and you've heard no response from their team. Third argument then, minorities will not become public figures in the world of proposition. The premise of this argument is that some people have more to hide in terms of personal privacy than others. Homosexual individuals, those recovering from mental illness, or HIV-positive persons all have a much greater degree of concern over whether these things will be revealed to the public than you or I. The problem is that proposition creates a disincentive for these individuals to participate in public life. When they know it is very likely that these details will be revealed in the public interest, given that proposition thinks these are things that you ought to be able to vote on, then they are not going to enter politics, they are not going to enter the public sphere, they are not going to become influential societal leaders, because their degree of fear is much greater than that of an average person who does not have all of these things to fear. What are the harms of this? First, it obviously means that these individuals have their choices infringed upon because they cannot access the public sphere at the point where they are not able to do so free of fear. We would point out that this is more important than the general society because we owe special obligations to these minority individuals over whom we have trampled for a very long time. Even if it is true that the public has a right to know about these things and the general society is benefited through the disclosure of information, these special obligations we owe to historically disenfranchised individuals are far more important. For these reasons, I'm proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the second speaker of the opposition, and now we continue with the third speaker of the proposition.
Can I be heard? Okay. If Joe Biden develops dementia, we ought to know because we need to know who exactly we are voting for. We need to know who we have entrusted to govern us. This is not whether or not he displays these dementia symptoms on national TV. It is about when we know this fact that there is a large potential for this one sickness to mean that he may accidentally forget what the nuclear code is, he may accidentally touch it, he may do actions that will literally screw over a country. We say people ought to have the right to know and make decisions based off that. This is not just about whether or not something has existed, because recognize if that is their train of logic, all of the harms will become consequential. We will find out he has the sickness after something bad has happened. On side proposition, we will much prefer a world where all these harms have yet to materialize and millions of the population are better protected. 3 questions in my speech. 1, is the privacy of individuals absolute? How do we weigh up the right to privacy versus information? 2, on the idea of what sort of information is revealed and how exactly does it affect different groups of people. Thirdly, on a very short question on who determines public interest. We don't think this is too important, but side opposition forces us to bicker on this. First question, is the privacy of individuals absolute and how do we weigh against the principle? The frame of this is that we never believe there is an absolute right to privacy. We already recognize this in the status quo. There are already instances where we're willing to forego individual privacy for a larger collective good. When you have important criminal trials, even if victims don't want to be revealed, the fact that they have opted into the legal system and the fact that because all of these institutions rely on individuals being accounted to it and being willing to play a part of it means that it is a necessary form of privacy to be shown to the public. And exactly as what opposition says, incidents of the Brett Kavanaugh sexual abuse case would be worthy to put in the public sphere. What exactly did we tell you? We told you 3 things. 1, the very principle that if you have this information at hand, but you actively choose not to report it and reveal it, this is a direct act of deception, which is no worse than lying. But there's no better than lying. This misconstrues the general public's perception of prominent individuals that often they do have a direct effect on them. It's not only whether or not they do indeed have an effect on them, but the fact that you're allowing these people to have this much power in a society, having these information hidden and having the potential to inflict harm on other people, we think this is something that individuals principally already have a right to know. Secondly, Mark told you the fact that many of these information are directly provided by the public and given to you by the public. Therefore, you ought to return and you ought to show people this information in return. There was no response coming from side opposition whatsoever. Thirdly, we told you we recognize the possible and the potential detriment even if it had yet to happen. Because we recognize that once that detriment happens, it becomes far too great for side opposition to swallow. This is why we actively stand on our side. What did opposition say in response? 1, their main response is private information does not actually affect public policy. Recognize, panel, this is also the premise of the entirety of their argumentation. Because once we are able to prove to you that it does indeed affect the public, we think they have immediately crossed the house. What do we do in terms of this? We say that private information often reveals the moral compasses of a politician, i.e., if a certain politician makes a misogynistic comment regularly and mistreats their wife at home, we think this is something worthy of the public to see, because this shows that this individual is likely to tell different versions of the story, is likely to be, let's say, less trustworthy, and we think this harm in and of itself, even if it's a potential harm, is something that's worthy of the public being able to see before they cast their ballots. Because we don't want politicians who go in campaigning for the rights of poor people, but then suddenly back out after they're elected. This is the harm we think that often happens on their side of the house. But secondly, given Jenna told you very clearly, why many people vote based off the perception of a politician, which, by the way, we say is a perfectly legitimate and reasonable reason and influence that influence is something that we think it's okay that people vote for. Therefore, they ought not to be deceived when the information is available. Thirdly, we say that the only reason it is okay for other people to make decisions on behalf of yourself, i.e. politicians and like these state institutions that have the monopoly over power in general, we say it is because of the notion you know who exactly is representing you and the truest forms of those individuals. Because we think democracy is not only about whether we produce the best outcomes, but whether the process of it is just and individuals feel dignified and not lied to in a system. No, thank you. Secondly, they say that ordinary people are also harmed. Jen has told you very clearly that this debate is not about ordinary people, because whether some dude in X neighborhood is gay is not something that the public cares about, and to a large extent, it doesn't really matter. Third thing, we tell you in addition that we think a politician or a prominent or public figure's job nature is different from the ordinary person in the workplace. Their job is inherently granted to you by the public and ensured by the public trust and will to allow them to govern and influence massive groups of individuals. Therefore, this signifies the need that the public ought to be the most fully informed as possible, as we think that it has a potential impact to the harms of their governance. The last thing they say is on the idea on coercive choice. i.e. victims of certain court cases or like things being revealed in the crossfire of media attention. We think that in these cases, these individuals ought to go into court and filing a case. As I told you clearly, the legitimacy of these CJS and public institutions exists because we buy into the very system. Because if you want to use the full force of the state and protection of the state, and given the state has been monopoly of violence against someone who has been proven to be wrong, you need to do so. We went on 3 grounds independently in this argument. 1, the fact that there's a huge number of people benefited on our side. Don't let them fool you by saying that this doesn't matter because they have a marginal impact and benefit. No, these individuals often make decisions based on what prominent figures in society present themselves as, especially in societal and political decisions. We are often affected. The fact that people have been debating on Trump's mental health for so long, we think is a clear example. Secondly, we think that we reduce the possible harm that may be largely detrimental in the long term. And lastly, on power asymmetry. These individuals often have immense power over society. The regular individual is unlikely to be able to reveal this or ever make a choice because of knowing this. Therefore, we think there's a right for them to be revealed. But sure.
How is a gay politician like Harvey Milk supposed to run for election when he knows that his sexual past will be revealed for everyone to see and he will be castigated for it?
Okay, if you are a public figure, we think it's fine if the population thinks they don't want to vote for a gay politician. Secondly, what sort of information is actually revealed and how does this information affect the public? Recognized opposition's only benefit is that this information will now overtake coverage for actual policy. 1, they haven't proven to us why actual policy should be the only thing circulating around the media, given many individuals form their political views based on the impressions of a politician and what sort of person they are. So on their side, we think speculation will still likely exist because people are generally interested in these things. They haven't proven to you the alternative. Jenna tells you and Mark tells you why people are more informed on our side of the house. That's intrinsically good, independent of any outcome. We think that means that individuals are not fooled into a system where they have no control over, and more importantly, we're able to do things like have resources or have more investigations into crime also unresponded to. Very quick note on the determination of a public interest. We think that proposition simply has this yet to claim, and we think the public's right is always closely related to whatever thing that's reported. Even in our worst case panel at the end of the day, when some tabloids may be reported through a misjudgment of what a public interest is. In general, we are okay with this trade-off in a minority of cases. Given on our side, we review the worst and the most detrimental possible outcomes that can exist in humanity.
I'd like to thank the third speaker of the proposition, and now we continue with the third speaker of the opposition.
Hi, can everyone hear me and see me? Excellent. Behind all of their rhetoric about people getting fooled, I want to listen very closely to what the premise of the proposition case actually is. Because the premise of their case is actually fairly simple. It's that people should be allowed to vote on whatever they want, and on the basis of any information they want. And look, the only justification for this that we get is that, but people can do this in status quo. Unfortunately for them, and fortunately for the rest of us, this debate isn't actually about whether people can make decisions on information like this. This debate is about whether they ought to. So every single time they tell us, people can choose to vote on whatever they want. Look, it might be true that someone can choose to vote out a politician on the basis of his sexuality. It might be true that they can choose to vote out someone on the basis of their race. The key contention we have in this debate is that we should not enable them to take such immoral actions. Their failure to respond to this key thrust means that the premise of their case is already taken out, because this debate is a normative one, not merely a positive one. I'm going to ask 2 questions. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to weigh public interest against privacy. The next thing I'm going to do is explain why their conception of the public interest actually doesn't yield any benefit and in fact yields more harm. So first, I'm going to take them at their best case. Let's do some weighing. The first thing I'm going to do here is let's just assume, so best case, right? Let's assume the public interest has some benefits. Let's take a look, step back and think, what exactly were these harms and benefits they were talking about? No, because the main harm they suddenly retreated to was this rather bizarre claim on Joe Biden developing dementia. But look, this debate isn't about Joe Biden developing dementia. Because we have psychologists for that. Because if you want to become a president, you have to go through a series of rigorous tests to make sure that you're not above a certain age, to make sure that you're not above a certain weight, to make sure that you pass psychological tests. So clearly, if Joe Biden had dementia, we would filter him out on either side. But the next thing they started to talk about was this rather bizarre example about a politician who abused his wife. And here's the first thing we told you, that this debate clearly isn't actually about crimes. Because we told you that at the point where someone commits a crime, this is when they violate the social contract, and the government is okay. It's justified for the government to take rights away from criminals. That's why we jail them, because we take away their right to free movement. And we tell you in this case, the right to privacy is no different. But the second thing in the case of this example of misogyny, don't let them get away by assuming that this person isn't going to be prosecuted. Because we can investigate and will prosecute politicians on both sides of the house. The difference is this. Under their side, if this woman who has been on the receiving end of rape from her own husband does not want to talk to the public about it, we will protect that right. We will allow her to remain silent when it suits her the most. The difference is that on their side of the house, the media will go to her house and force her to give her opinion on this. An incredibly traumatic event I don't think anyone ought to go through. That's it. Here are a few reasons after we've taken out these really exacerbated harms they want to give us. So no, these harms really aren't as bad as they're trying to play out. What exactly are the reasons as to why privacy outweighs this and the public interest? The first is that often these people had no choice in being in the situation. So we told you, often a politician doesn't have any choice as to whether his relationship with his wife sours, because at the end of the day, this is something he fundamentally cannot control. A victim of rape does not have any choice in this matter for incredibly obvious reasons. And at the point where this might benefit a lot of other people, if people don't have consent and cannot meaningfully consent to this in any way, that is when we ought not to do it for them. So this also takes out the new argument they make about how politicians consent to this. Because note, they don't consent to the types of things that happen in their personal lives. And at the point where they don't consent to these things, we really ought not to foist it upon them. The second thing we told you about was about concentrated harms versus diffuse benefits. Because think about it, at the end of the day, the public will forget what happened. They aren't going to think about it every day. For them, it's probably a headline they read, they laugh at, they joke at, and they move on. But for this public figure, for his family, every time they walk outside, they need to cover their faces. They cannot look people in the eye because they are filled with shame about information that people know. So note, again, no analysis here. This also takes out their weighing on multiple people versus one person. The other thing we told you about was certainty. No, because at the end of the day, and this is something they never responded to down the bench, it's incredibly uncertain, isn't it, as to whether or not the public is going to factor this information in. So let's say you make it known to everyone that maybe a politician cheated on his wife. Let's say you make it known to everyone that a politician's son has moved away from him because he's angry at him because he's a bad father. It's genuinely unclear as to whether some members of the public are even going to care. It's unclear as to whether people are actually going to factor this into their decision making. The lack of certainty means that we ought not to do this in the vast majority of cases. But the last thing is the most detrimental thing. We told you we had an obligation to minorities and victims of historical repression. This was a second speaker argument, when we told you that gay politicians can't do things like run for basic office under their side of the house. I'm going to explain why this is important here. The first reason this outweighs privacy is because, honestly, we owe an obligation to this person at the point where society has discriminated against him for very long. This is something we wrote in second speaker, had no response to. But the second thing is what we also told you in second, when we told you that the right for someone to run for public office is significantly more important than the right for other people to merely know you are gay and laugh at you and stigmatize you, given that the right to run for public office is an incredibly important part of political systems. So as a consequence, we told you that we owe an obligation to minorities, and this outweighs public interest. So here, I've taken them at their best so far. Let's say public interest yields some benefit. I've shown you why we outweighed it. Now, what I'm going to do is simple. What I'm going to do is tell you and move on to my second question on whether public interest actually even yields benefit. And look, don't be mistaken by the fact that they spent 24 minutes talking about this, because they actually only had one mechanism for why public interest yields benefits. The mechanism was this. It's important to know that public figures are immoral because you vote on the basis of their morality. This is literally the entire case. So if I take this out, we win the debate. First thing we told you, he's shocking the majority burden. Because not all information in the public interest pertains to morality. So for instance, again, on the politician and his sexuality, this is not something that's moral. A politician being gay is probably not going to influence his ability to be a public officer in any way. So I suspect that given that this has nothing whatsoever to do with morality, they probably ought not to talk about this. Given that often things like the politician's family, like the fact that maybe Boris Johnson's daughter doesn't have very good mental health because she's always felt rather uncomfortable around her father being a prominent figure, is something that has nothing to do with morality and everything to do with intimate family relationships just happening to not work out. As a consequence, they've already shrunk that case to very, very small instances when they talk about morality. Second response, something we gave you from the beginning of the debate. Here's where we told you that what matters is not how they exercise these values at home. What matters is how they exercise these values in the workplace. So sure, even if he's not loyal to his wife at home, this does not mean he's not going to be loyal to people like in his public office. And if they aren't, and we told you very clearly, if a politician is not going to keep his oaths, we told you obviously this information will be made public because it's not about his personal life. Now, the new response we hear is that, but knowledge of politicians' behaviors is a good indicator of how they behave in office. The problem was that we never heard a response to this. We never heard a justification for this. All they say is that if a politician is not loyal in his house, he might not be loyal in the office. So honestly, we have no reason to believe this claim at all. But let me give you a counter reason we gave from first. We told you that politicians are bound by the electoral mechanism. So often, they are bound as a consequence, even if they are not loyal at home, to display these characteristics in work. Because if they don't display these characteristics in work, they're going to get voted out. Why is this important? Because we told you that the public should only have information in regards to the politician's public office, because that is the only part of his life that affects them. Given that I've proven the only way they are affected by politicians is by public office, and the fact that their personal life does not impair their ability to, for instance, execute abilities there, we think we win on that basis. But next, I'm going to do some weighing, because what we told you was when we gave you a harm, we told you about how actual policy is crowded out under their side. The only response we get in third is, but actual policy is not that important. And look, even if actual policy is not that important, all we need to prove is that actual policy is more important than personal life. The reason we gave you down the line as to why this was true was because often, even if the personal life of a politician might affect his ability to execute things to some extent, his public policy affects you significantly more. So given the fact that his public policy affects you significantly more, his public policy is even more important information. And if it's crowded out, this means that more important information is crowded out under their side. So they undermine the public right to know even more when it comes to important things. For all these reasons, I'm very, very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the third opposition speaker, and now we are moving on to the replies. Opposition goes first.
Can everyone hear me? Thank you. This debate, quite clearly, is about weighing. It's not about whether the public has or has not a right to know. It's about whether the public right to know, if it exists, is more or less important than an individual's right to privacy. Given that, it is quite strange that we hear only one mechanism to prove this from the proposition team, which is basically, well, there are more people in the public than there are other individual public figures. Well, and therefore the numerical mathematics of it means that the former is more important. We disputed this and provided two alternative mechanisms, which proposition never responded to. We disputed this by saying that the nature of harm to each of those people is very different. There are highly concentrated harms to the small number of politicians and public figures, and there are incredibly diffuse and almost non-existent benefits to the vast majority of society. That is why the numerical analysis proposition provides just does not stand. Further, we told you two reasons why privacy was more important. First, because individuals don't consent to what goes on in their private life. Even if it's true that they consent to becoming public figures, they cannot control what subsequently happens in their public life. Whether, for example, they have sour relations with their family, or whether the family themselves becomes investigated by the media, because this is information which is in the public interest by proposition's own admission. Second, we told you that the benefits that we were talking about were far more certain than those that proposition discussed, which was why it was preferable to take this certain benefit over theirs. So it is too late for proposition to provide a new weighing mechanism in reply speech, which means that even if you accept everything they say about the benefits and the public's right to know, it cannot be more important than the rights to privacy for the reasons I've discussed. So what then did the proposition world look like? To their credit, the proposition world was rather straightforward. People vote on whatever they want: sexuality, race, gender identity, history of mental illness. Sure. The question in this debate is, should they do so? the question in this debate is not necessarily whether people do this in the status quo, given that the two teams have the capacity to change what people vote on. And in my second speech, I proved to you why we should not vote on all of these things. And the reason was because voting is instrumental. It attempts to aggregate the interests of an individual. And voting on sexuality or gender identity does not aggregate the real interests of the individual in terms of how their actual lived experience will be affected by the actions of a politician. Given that the teams in this debate are in a position to change how people cast their votes, I've proven that it should be in the way that opposition describes and focus on substantive policy positions. But we further proved and met proposition's challenge that people don't actually find significant use from the information that is revealed in their world. Because if it is true that the public image is significantly different from their private life, and their public image is totally consistent over time, then we don't see the relevance of their private life if it never leaks into the public sphere and voters never interact with it. But behind this world of proposition was a callous cost that they were never willing to countenance. The individuals who would be blocked out from politics and public life in their world as a result of this barrage of media attention. People who have far more sensitive details than the average politician will be blocked out of running, and this was far more important than the public's right to know, given our historical and special obligations to them. In contrast, the world of opposition respected privacy, not only for politicians who may have dubiously consented to being in the public limelight, but for their families, for their victims, and for everyone else who would also be dragged into the gutter in the world of proposition. And we also pointed out there are a number of red herrings that proposition pointed out that are really not relevant to this debate. Investigating crimes, for instance, is far better on our side, and I proved in my second speech why actually proposition harms it. And investigating institutions, again, not something that is dropped on our side, given the difference between personal and private lives. I suspect this is why proposition did not talk at all about them in their third speech, and we don't want to hear it again in reply. So what have I proven? The world of opposition not only respects privacy, it has a better way for judging politicians and public figures. For these reasons, we believe that everyone should have the right to remain silent. I'm proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition reply speaker. Now for the final speech of the debate, I'd like to invite the proposition reply speaker.
Okay. Our society exists because we make commitments to each other. We created a democratic government and let people make decisions for us about what laws we follow, what rights we are entitled to, because people have obligations to us. We create a justice system that has the ability to violate our privacy by creating convictions, incarcerating us, issuing search warrants, because those people have obligations to us. As a result, your supposed entitled right to run a successful political campaign is much less important than people's right to vote freely and know what people are up to. Two questions in this reply. Firstly, whether or not people have a right to this information, and secondly, on holding people accountable. Firstly, then, on the right, because we told you that when it comes to public figures and politicians, yeah, you do have a right, because democracy isn't about the final outcome. It's the idea that you are giving someone the ability to make decisions that should be yours. It is the idea that we should not force people to put people in power and make people their rulers if they do not trust them, that you should consent to your vote completely. Because if you don't want to risk a presidential candidate with dementia, if you are a cautious voter who wants to be preempted, you absolutely have the right to do so. We told you then that they tried to push the idea that people are tricked into caring about these things by the media, despite the fact that we told you early on that politicians are the ones who forward these narratives, that they are capable, that they run successful personal lives as well. The idea that they should have the power to do that and deceive the public, but no one should hold them accountable, was laughable and never responded to. Because we told you that these kinds of jobs, when your personal life is linked to the public interest, it is not like most jobs. You are entitled to that information because unlike most jobs where your private life doesn't matter, it does here. We told you the fact that you consented to that risk when you became a public figure. We brought this up way back when we pointed out that there are people like Richard Burr who are politicians who normally his finances would be his business. When he decides to not disclose information about COVID and then make investments in COVID, why opposition doesn't think that the public has a right to know that that's not in their best interests is beyond the entire team. Because we told you at the end of the day, the media's job is to serve the people. It is not to dictate what they should vote on, not to blind them and prevent them from making that decision. At the end of the day, proposition stood by the principle that if people care, they care. If they don't care. And whether or not the media reports on it, with the impact of that reporting is up to the people. Secondly, then, on the idea of accountability. Because we asked opposition earlier on, when would they violate privacy? Would they, for example, report on criminal trials? They told us, yeah, definitely, we'll report on court cases, just super, super privately. And they never told us what details they would admit and what details they would include. They told us, yeah, okay, we'll have the Kavanaugh hearing before the Supreme Court, but we're not going to include details about the sexual assault and the incidents surrounding it. So the question really became, how on earth on opposition does the public see if institutions have gone wrong? We told you all the way back in P2 that it is the media's job to do things like hold the police to account. When police are able to discriminate against witnesses, when police don't follow leads or get attached to certain theories without good reason, it is up to the people to have that information and then make judgments on it. We don't think this argument got anywhere near enough response as it needed to. The idea that if the media has information about suspicious personal behavior, because if we don't have that type of transparency between legislators, between the police, between judges, it is not okay, and the people cannot hold those people to account and determine whether or not things really went right. In the Brett Kavanaugh hearing, it is important for people to know about the incidents surrounding that case, because whether or not Congress decides he is fit to become a Supreme Court justice, it is important on whether or not the people believe in that. We on side proposition believe that it is the people who come first. Yes, the public is a very large and vast force. Yes, individuals are important too. But we think when we have created a society, when we give these structures the type of power to wreck our lives or make them, it is absolutely important that we know what goes behind closed doors.
I'd like to thank the proposition reply speaker, and I'd like to thank